Hi foxes, and welcome back to my channel, or if you are new here, welcome. I hope that this video helps you in some way, and if you like it enough, you will subscribe to my channel. I mostly talk about vintage and vintage fashion and tips for vintage sellers, and today is not an exception. We are going to be talking about 5 tips for newbie vintage sellers. So if you're just getting into vintage, maybe you've been selling like couple months, or you want to try it out, or even up to a year, I think these tips can really help you. And so I hope you will stick around for the whole video, and don't forget to give me a thumbs up if you end up liking this content. So my name is Brittany, and I'm also known as SHOPFOXBURROW on all the sites, Poshmark, Etsy, here on YouTube, Instagram, and yeah, I've been doing this for over 12 years now, and I've just kind of learned some stuff along the way that I wanted to sort of share with you if you are new to buying vintage. The first thing that I want to share is, I mean, it might seem obvious, but I feel like when you are first starting out, there's that real like pull to like just sort of buy any kind of vintage that you see, because you feel like you're trying out new stuff, you don't know what's gonna sell, and then maybe you live in like a populated area where vintage is hard to come by, so you just sort of buy all the vintage that you see. And for me, that's a big no-no. So my first tip would be, just because it's vintage doesn't mean it's good. And that's kind of a hard pill to swallow for a little while, but the longer that you start to sell vintage, the more you'll realize that some things really do better than others. And while most vintage is better made than modern stuff, some of it, I mean, you could just find a similar thing very easily at Target or something like that. So it's going to be a very hard sell for someone to pay you a decent wage to buy that item, if that makes sense. So some of the things I avoid are very plain items. There can be a good market for minimalist vintage, but usually it's found in like silk shirts, chambray shirts, you know, button front skirts, things with really good shape and really good structure, but like pencil skirts that are plain colors, solid button-up shirts in cotton, I mean, things like that. Just because they're vintage, that doesn't really make them good. There's also some stuff that you just have to admit was ugly. You know, just like today you see stuff in the store and you're like, oh my god, no. And that was true for vintage as well. Like back in, you know, the 70s, the 80s, I'm sure people walked into stores and they were like, wow, that's just like a really ugly color combination, or there's just something about it that is just off-putting. So definitely keep an eye on what you're buying. It's more about style than anything else. Just because it's vintage doesn't make it good, and just keep an eye on it. The second thing I want to talk about is a little bit more of like a newer phenomenon. So when I first started selling vintage, you know, the general idea was keep an eye on runway trends, like what's happening on the runway, because that's what people were going to be looking for the next year. And while I think that some of that is still a little bit true, I mean, you do sort of see trends from the runway bleed through. Sometimes they kind of bleed through like a year or two later. So I feel like in terms of making more sales and paying attention to something that will make you more sales, the new phenomenon of internet trends actually drives way more sales than runway trends. So when I'm talking about internet trends, I'm talking about things like dark academia, like cottagecore, like goblin core or nightcore, you know, just anything that sort of is generated on the internet where, you know, hashtags basically created it, because you can use those hashtags to drive people to your listings. And honestly, the more people who catch on to them, not necessarily the better, because, you know, when we first started cottagecore, the people who knew about cottagecore would have tagged their items correctly. And then it kind of spread through the reseller world, like cottagecore, oh my god, you know, and you start seeing it in all this marketing. And so everyone is tagging their stuff cottagecore when it's not really the aesthetic that the people who wear cottagecore are looking for. So sometimes the very like small specific trends can actually get you the most sales, because if you tag the items correctly and they really are on trend for that internet style, then the people who find them are going to fall in love with them, and you're going to be more likely to make a sale. So if I were you, I would focus on the smaller trends and try and keep on top of what people are coming up with and kind of tag that. One of the major trends we're going to see coming back is actually Twee, T-W-E-E. And that's just sort of like, I mean, honestly, it's like kind of how I dress, like very mod cloth, inspired, like Zooey Deschanel, you know, the bangs and the swishy A-line dresses, and if you just Google Twee, you'll sort of see what I'm talking about. But it was very popular in like the early 2010s, and we've just kind of been cycling through all of the different eras, right? Like we did 90s, we are doing Y2K, now we're going for Twee. So it's just sort of like one of those keywords to keep an eye on, and if you have something that matches up, then you can tag it. And one thing I will say for runway trends, if you are going to keep an eye on them, one of the best things you can keep an eye on is colors and color stories, because people actually do tend to look for that. So like this year, for example, purple is going to be very popular, all shades of purple, but specifically lilac or lavender. And so when you're outsourcing, if you see a piece and maybe you wouldn't normally pick it up, but it's that color, you can kind of take a second look at it and say like, actually, is the shape of this really nice? Would someone want this? Because it is that color that people are going to be searching for. The next thing is to buy unique stuff, weird stuff. People like weird stuff. You know, I feel like there's beautiful vintage and there's also weird vintage, and between the two, honestly, in my opinion, the weird vintage sells better because it's more unique and it kind of will have something that will like grip somebody, so there's going to be something about it that somebody falls in love with. So I'm going to pop up some pictures of some weird vintage that I think sort of embodies this idea. Things that I've sold, things that other people have sold, things that are available now. And I mean, it sort of develops a following. You know, maybe it doesn't sell right away, but sometimes a lot of that can bring a lot of traction to your shop, and when it does finally find its perfect buyer, you know it's pretty awesome because they're gonna love it kind of as much as you did when you picked it up and were like, whoa, this is out there. So you know, if you're given the choice between weird vintage and plain vintage, people like weird. People like weird. Buy the weird stuff. Buy the stuff that you don't see every day. My next tip, and this one is not going to be doable for everybody, so if it's not doable for you, just don't worry about it. It's okay. And that is if you're able to source all year for all types of clothing. So by the time that your stores are starting to put sweaters out onto the rack, not only are they going to be picked over by other people who are looking for sweaters at that time of year, but they're also already like almost a month behind when people online are starting to search for sweaters. So people online are starting to search for sweaters in like August, September, and then you know your stores might be putting out sweaters in October or November, and so you really want to have those sweaters listed before the stores are putting them out. So if you can source the off items like shorts in the winter or sweaters in the summer, you can really get better stuff because fewer people are looking for them, and then you'll already have it on hand when it is this season that you should be listing it. So, you know, a lot of times in February, it's like a big resurgence of people buying swimsuits, because in March, or even in February, they are going on a cruise, or they're going to Las Vegas, or they're going somewhere where it's actually warm enough for them to dip their toes in the water, and they want a cute new swimsuit. And, you know, if you're trying to find a swimsuit at your thrift stores in February, you can't. So sort of to source that stuff all year long is going to help you be on time for when people are looking for things online. And my last tip, and something that I feel like I get a lot of people asking about, is brands and whether or not they matter. You know, people will ask me like what brands I'm looking for in, like, you know, the 80s era or the 70s era, or like, is this a brand that's worth a lot of money? And I think that the answer to that is that brands really only matter about 15% of the time. Style is really more important. I mean, you take Gunny Sacks, for example, and Gunny Sacks made dresses from the, I think, the very late 60s, very early 70s into, you know, the 90s. And so the 90s dresses and the late 80s dresses, they're not going to do as well. They're not going to command as much money. You know, you might sell a 90s Gunny Sacks dress for $35 or $40, and you might sell a 70s Gunny Sacks dress for $500. So it's really not so much about the brand as it is about the style that people are, I'm sorry, I almost dropped my phone, the style that people are looking for. And so, you know, if you are at the thrift store and you come across something that you think is really awesome, but the brand is White Stag, which was Walmart, you know, is Walmart back in the day, who cares? Buy it. It's, if you like it and you like the aesthetic of it, it's not about the brand. It's about the keywords that you use. It's about the fact that it's vintage. It's about the era. It's about the shape. And it's just not, the brand only matters so much. Yes, for some brands, you're going to be able to charge a lot more money for them, you know, especially if they are designer. But with run-of-the-mill vintage, it could just as easily be unbranded as have a brand, and the value is going to be the same. So, in my opinion, the only real reason that I like to keep up with specific brands, you know, I do have some favorite vintage brands that I'm always excited to find, but it's always because the style is what I like. Sometimes I find a dress from the brand All That Jazz and it is amazing. Everything my 90s heart could ever want. And sometimes I find a dress from that brand and it's like, it's okay, you know? So there are brands that I like to keep an eye out for. There are brands that are worth more money, but it's really about style. I don't pick up every All That Jazz dress that I see, even though I love the brand. And the reason for that is that the style isn't always there. And the more that you sell, the more that you kind of develop a sense of what you like to pick up, what excites you, and also what is exciting your customers and what makes them hit the buy button. So those are my 5 tips for new vintage sellers. I think it can be a very hard game to get into. There is a lot of closed offness to the vintage community when it comes to what to source, how to price, where to sell, and so everything that I learned, I sort of learned through whole lot of research and trial and error. And I'm willing to share that with you guys, and hopefully it does help you. I think the more that we can save vintage clothing, the more vintage sellers that are out there, the more normalized we can make selling vintage, rescuing stuff from estate sales with bins, or, you know, saving trashed clothes that no one else wants in the thrift store, the better. So I hope that this video helped you. If you have any tips for new vintage sellers, if you're like a more experienced seller and you just happen to watch this video, go ahead and drop them in the comments down below, and I would love to see what you have to say. So thanks so much for tuning in. I'm hoping to do another video soon about my goals for 2022, and just kind of hopefully you guys have developed your goals. Hopefully you've watched my video on goal setting for the year, and I'm ready to share mine with you. So I will see you for my next video, and have a great day.